everybody. Welcome to A Drink with the Idler. Will you unmute quickly and tell us where you are? Say hello.
Hello from
Hello from Devon.
From Arundel.
Hello from
Cardiff.
Hello from London.
Pompey. We're from Pompey.
Pompey. Great stuff. Okay, everybody. Thanks for being here. Time to mute now. If you could all mute your microphones, that would be great. We have our head of philosophy, Mark Vernon, here as usual. Hi, Mark.
Hey there. Hi there.
We've got Mark and we've got the Idler editor, Tom, who's got some stuff to show you. He wants to chip in. Tom.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Victoria. Just two quick things. The new issue's out basically today. So I hope you've either received it digitally or physically. If you've done neither of those things, you can buy it in a shop like Waitrose, Waterstones or Smith's. And we've got this lovely cover with Giles and Mary from Gogglebox. Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, has written for us. And there's a piece about a new anarchistic skateboarding commune in Doncaster, which is great. So do check that out. A couple of weeks ago, I sent an email to everyone about letter writing, and we've had a lovely response. People have been sending letters and postcards into the office, and these are coming from all over the place. And I just wanted to quickly run through some of these and say thank you. Thank you to Elizabeth for this lovely card, which is a 1949 painting. We got a card from Prague, from Ava. Thank you so much. We got this lovely Paddington note, and that comes from Mark, who's a digital subscriber. Contributor Jenny Bardwell has sent this postcard, which is a picture of Gainsborough's house. All the way from Montenegro, which is a famous slackers hangout. There's Tim Layton, who now lives there. Good idling. There's a card here from Pamela Holmes, who writes from Suffolk, and there is a church with a painted roof and some lovely figures. This one comes all the way from the Falkland Islands. Thank you, Maria. Maria says, my once neat hand is now more of a scrawl. I think it's quite good, Maria, your handwriting. And last but not least, this lovely card from Barbados, where Banner says, slow is good, fast is bad, small is beautiful, less is more. We couldn't put it better ourselves. Thanks, Banner, so much.
Yeah, nice postcards. Thanks, everybody. Now, our special guest today is award-winning writer Aniefiok Ekpoudom. He has written for many publications from The Guardian and Vogue to Vice, and worked for grassroots platforms like GRM Daily, Up TV and SBTV. We're going to be discussing his new book this evening, Where We Come From, Rap, Hope and Home in Modern Britain, which Tom's been holding up. In it, he tells the stories of the people, voices and communities of the British rap and grime scenes. This is the music of my kids, and at last we found someone who can explain it all. Tom will be talking to Aniefiok in a minute. Remember, it's your chance to ask questions too. Send them to me, Victoria, in the chat, and I'll pick as many of you as possible to come on screen at the Q&A and ask Neef your questions. And remember too, you're invited to stay on at the end. When the speakers leave at 7 o'clock, we love you to stay on and chat. Everybody welcome. So welcome now, lovely to see you. And we'll go to Mark for his philosophical thought of the week. Mark, how are you?
Hi there. Hello. Well, look, I've been grabbed this week by a wonderful expression which felt very idlerish to me by the ecological writer Catherine Keller, where she talks about today, and this is the quote, all of us live by deadlines. All of us live by deadlines. And I felt I immediately got what she meant. It might be the kind of media pressure, you know, the media runs by deadlines, but then introduces that sense that every moment there's got to be a new headline, a decision made, a scandal exposed. That whole sort of sense of the collapse of time in a hypermedia age like ours. Personally, you know, many of us spend a very substantial proportion of our working lives working not for now, but for this future deadline. You know, when the mortgage will be paid off, when the pension will kick in, when we're going to pass on wealth to a future generation. Education, of course, with examinations and tests, a constant sense of deadline approaching, which if you've got kids in education, you'll immediately recognize. Old age, another deadline that must be defeated maybe by the tech bros, or we'll get to Mars first before Earth gets consumed by the heat. A lot of our present life, it feels, is living by deadlines. You know, even the sort of technological progress, which brings many, many great benefits, but it's the deadline of, you know, the next iteration of the phone, or the next upgrade of the iPad, or tomorrow things will be even better. What lies behind this mentality, which is so pervasive? Because it wasn't always so, I don't think. Tom, amongst others, has written about more cyclical experiences of time and the seasons and religious festivals and so on in the medieval world, in the ancient world. Sometimes it is blamed, this linear view of time, that it has a kind of beginning with a kind of crisis and then a desperation to restore things at the end. That linear view, eschatological as it's sometimes called, on the Judeo-Christian tradition, I suspect it actually more comes from the early modern period. Because if you read figures like Francis Bacon, the Elizabethan philosopher who became so seminal in the philosophy of science, he talks a lot about how technology and science is being given to us so that we can remake the world, so that we can alleviate suffering, so that we can improve our lot. And he even talks about restoring Eden to Earth. That gives a sense of certainly sort of vocation and direction of travel, which is so powerful in the modern world, but also this sense, the need for progress, the need to better now. And so kind of discounts the present and puts the emphasis on the future. But it feels to me it's just created a sense now of sort of not just progress, not just things getting better, but a kind of need for a sort of panicky escape. We mustn't waste time, because somehow if we do, we're going to miss it. And our lives will come to naught. We'll only have to look back with grief and loss, if not sort of fear and panic about all that's gone wrong. You know, it's why we live with this sort of strange sense of, the one hand, just being regimented cogs in the machine, but also kind of addicted to the next thing at the same time. A real confusion of things. Now, you know, how to cut through this, it's not straightforward, of course, because it so profoundly affects our psyche and excludes from vision even different ways of seeing time. But I think I sort of stand to reject this idea that salvation somehow lies in the future, whether you regard that as in a religious way or a secular way, is one thing. And also, even more tricky perhaps, is to recognize that heaven is not a place on earth, because that forces the sense that now can't be trusted, that it needs to be improved, there's deep ills that somehow must be corrected, but that maybe getting glimpses of earth being a place in heaven, the other way round, there's good now, which if we pay attention to the present, we might spot. The way that the Greeks would have put this is to think about time, not in the sense of chronological time, just kind of calendar time unfolding into an anticipated future, but kairos time, the sense that there can be a moment. This word kairos comes originally from the activity of, say, spinning, when there was the right moment to throw the shuttle through the loom and so on, and so create the fabric. Or it was used in rhetoric, the waiting for the right moment to deliver the right words that can then move the crowds. That was the kind of chirological moment. So anyway, this reflection on living amidst deadlines and the pressure that that brings set me thinking about time again, and this idea of the present moment, not just living for the future, creating a moment in every day when you might live just for the now. It's easier in spring, you know, when you feel the light growing longer when you hear the birds so easily singing. There's a sense of something in the present unfolding, which is very enticing. I guess music can do it. Maybe we'll hear more about what music brings to people's lives. But music too can help focus attention in the present moment. And of course, idling. This is why I felt that this call, this observation about not living to deadlines felt such an idler theme to bring to the drinks this evening. So Tom, I'll hand over to you now, but I hope that provides some food for thought.
It does, Mark. Thank you so much. And I mean, really the story of the book is one of liberation through music. And, some of the stories that are in the book of some of these young people, what they sort of went through, what they grew up with, but how they turn these awful experiences into something incredibly positive, are really moving. Now, let's get the author in the room. Aniefiok, thanks so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Let's go back to really I was going to start with Windrush because that's kind of like a good starting point, and we'll come back to that. But in fact, you go right back to 1910s Cardiff, Wales, of the coal mining industries, and that feeds into this incredible story of how Black British music became such a sophisticated and big and successful thing. And what happened there? There was a sort of melting pot in Cardiff in the early 20th century.
Yeah, so in Cardiff, Cardiff is a dock town, so it's right by the docks. And when I was researching the book and going to Cardiff and reporting on the book, I started to meet people whose had ancestry traced back to Barbados or to Nigeria or to Jamaica or to Somalia, and their great-grandparents or grandparents had come to Cardiff, I guess, as sea merchants, stowing away on ships and then working on the ships. And when they landed in Cardiff in the early 1900s, some 1902, some 1905, some 1906, they ended up settling in a place by the water called Butte Town. And it was a large, I guess, multi-ethnic community in Cardiff. I think there were like 50 different nationalities living there. I think they said over like 100 languages being spoken in this really small corner of the city. Yeah. And their descendants continued to live in Cardiff. And when music came, specifically rap music came around, a lot of their descendants were participants in the genre. So the book, one of the people in the book I follow closely, Phil, he's of Greek Cypriot descent, and his family came in on the docks and then spread their veins into Cardiff thereafter.
Well, Phil's a great story. We might come back to that. He has a kind of religious revelation, doesn't he, when he's away and he's like in the sea. I mean, there's so many good stories in it, and they all sort of interweave. And like fast forwarding to Windrush, I mean, you make the point, it's been made elsewhere, of course, but, the people coming over on the boat in the 1950s, the England they found was not the one that they'd been led to believe existed. Basically, people were slightly less civilized and courteous than they thought they were going to be. Yeah,
definitely. I guess the idea was that they thought they were going to find in England where the roads were paved with gold. That was kind of like the dream a lot of them held in their minds. And then, of course, they came to England. It was very different. Like the weather was very different. And that was a big thing, kind of adapting to, especially in Birmingham, where a lot of the Windrush story I write about takes place in the book. Birmingham at that time is like, I guess, just after World War II, still like very heavily industrial town, especially if you were settling in and around the Black country. So it was like a very different climate and terrain. And then also at the same time with a lot of economic issues going on in the country too. And then, yeah, a lot of racism they faced too, as they tried to settle in and build new communities there and try to find work and build lives for themselves. So it was definitely, I think, a massive shock to a lot of the immigrants who came. And I guess they then, toiled in terms of trying to create something from nothing thereafter, whilst kind of battling that resistance too.
Now, they were obviously bringing their own, we're particularly talking about the Caribbean influence here, because, I mean, I suppose one of the main points of the book is that you say that, British rap emerges from this sort of like different influences. There's the sort of Caribbean stuff, which was at first, reggae, and then sort of toasting, which was a sort of form of rapping. But then also people were getting a lot of their information or their influences from New York too, from the sort of early 80s. And how did this, who was bringing these styles together? It was the next generation really who started to kind of meld these different cultures.
Yeah, definitely. The first generation born in the UK is when you start to see like a very specific style of British music, and Black British music and identity start to take shape and take form, with people borrowing from the music they've grown up listening to. So whether that be reggae and sounds like that, but then and sound system culture and whatnot, but then also blending it with music they've grown up to in the UK. And then of course in that time during like the late 70s and early 80s, hip hop starts to become a really big thing, of course, exporting itself from New York into the UK. And they start to blend all of these influences into almost something that they can call distinctly their own, and is spoken in a language that they understand, with slang that is a blend of all of these things that they understand. And I think the music began to, I guess, reflect, I guess, the new identities that were emerging in Britain at the time.
And these are very young people often, aren't they? I mean, they're starting when they're sort of, well, they might be starting from very young. I mean, some of the people you talk about, they're sort of, there's lots of music in the home. They're writing rhymes and poetry and music from, you know, a young age.
Yeah, I think music was almost something inherited. It's something people inherited, especially rap, and the role it plays in different communities across the UK, especially like the three places that I'm talking about in the book. Is something that you must do by osmosis. And it's like a sense of expression that kids pick up from 11, 12, 13, 14 and start participating in, practicing in. And I guess only a few are likely then to take that into a livelihood, but it doesn't mean that it had any less impact on those who didn't. It was still something they loved and treasured and kept with them, and still probably participating in their spare time and whatnot too.
That's a real theme in the book, isn't it? Because it's like, well, as I said earlier, a lot of the sort of creative people were, you know, they had some, I mean, some of the stories, you know, they've seen their stepdad shot dead in front of them. I mean, it's just unbelievable. You know, their own parents have got sort of addiction issues. There's often a kind of really hardworking mum in the middle of it all, sort of trying to hold it together. And they're hearing these stories about, you know, the sort of how difficult it is to make ends meet. And they feel often, I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them in your book, it seems to be a sort of common theme, just feel, you know, sort of quite lost and abandoned, really. And they can, you have this expression on the road, they you know, they basically turn to sort of petty crime to kind of, you know, get a few quid together. And music can be a liberation from that. It can also be a liberation from the job.
Yeah.
And that's the theme too that comes out, and that at least 2 or 3 of the people that you've interviewed, maybe we can go into like some of the details of them, but you know, they're bright people, they get these good jobs, they're very good at them, but something's gnawing at them, and then some sort of I don't know, they often get like, there's some sort of like epiphany. Tell us about the who was it who worked in the Apple shop for 8 years, and then
Despa. Yeah.
Tell us that story. That's an amazing. Tell us his tale. That's incredible.
Yeah, no, Despa is a man from just outside of Walsall, and he was son of Windrush parents, and always had a dream of building a music studio for himself and building a music company, especially at a time when that was kind of unheard of, especially in and around the West Midlands, if you were a rapper anyway. And he has a lot of hardship early on in his life, with his little brother, I think lost 2 brothers and a father and a granddad all in quick succession. And I guess is trying to find his own place in the world whilst recovering from that. And I think the real story and true testament to his life is that it isn't necessarily just about him going on to build a successful music studio. It's really that he goes music as a vessel for him to be able to find family again, and he starts his own family, but then finds these brothers in music. I'd love to read a little bit from his section, actually. That might be That
would be great, Neef. Yeah, please do. Yeah, we talked about that earlier. But I'd like everyone to hear some Neef's style, because it's got a lovely, it's lovely. It's beautiful prose.
No, thank you. So yeah, this is about Despa before he changed his name to Despa. Despa's his granddad's name, but he's initially called Ryan. And this is taken from chapter 5 called Middle England. When his granddad passed in 2001, Ryan was 18 and a fuck up. He was selling weed, he was debt collecting, he was fighting. He was a good-hearted boy, lost to a time and a place that demanded a stone-faced camouflage from its young. This is Darlaston, a small town on the edges of Walsall, an old coal town, a steel town, a blitz survival story. In the decades to come, he would scratch the place from memory, an era best buried, the sufferings in a shallow grave. But it's the early millennium now, and he's 18, still here, where he has always been. He's living with his mum, his grandparents live in a house across the road. This is all that he knows. Darlaston is in the Black Country, the region in the far north of the West Midlands, loosely defined in the 1800s, when black smoke from the many ironworks stained the horizon with an eternal fog. Here, as he was coming of age, among the ruins of these once booming industrial heartlands, towns like Darlaston were withering, smoke fading into dust, dust holding the ghosts of what once was. His generation were birthed in the ashes. They inherited a home where the population was falling, where unemployment was high, where expectations were low, and, as he says, almost nobody escapes. A home where the education system was flawed, where you left school to work, as he says, at the packing plant down the road, to work in retail, to work in a bar, to work in the Big Asda. Or, if you're him, you sell weed. You work at Burger King for a year, you work at the packing place for a few weeks, filling and moving boxes, then quit. You sell some ecstasy pills, you sell coke for a month. You spend your savings on a music studio and jelly babies in an era when UK garage was the sound of the time and something darker was readying to take its place. You live your days as your town and your generation has determined. You have done so for years now already. In those days, music was there. When his granddad and his brothers passed and the family withered, it was his salvation. In that period, the raps he wrote were angry, pain vibrations echoing out into a lonely world, relieving the tension in his chest. Music was his rock, constant glimmer in a fading night, the lighthouse beam at dead dawn. It saved him and an entire generation growing up in dark times. Yeah, that's
That's fantastic, beautiful.
No, thank you. So yeah, that's Ryan, also known as Despa. And he has probably one of the most, I guess, transformative stories that I wrote about in the book.
And Despa, didn't he work at Apple as well later?
Yeah, he got after leaving Darlaston, he moves to Birmingham and gets a job at the Apple store for about 4 or 5 years. And as he's there, it's kind of like he reaches a fork in the road. Like he's essentially managed to get this really good job at the Apple store, and he'd practiced music but had given that up to work at the Apple store and realized that he'd finally got this thing that he wanted, which was stability essentially. But something still,
the monthly paycheck is quite nice.
Yeah, no, definitely. But he still had that kind of gnawing feeling in him that music was what he found true fulfillment in, and he didn't feel like he was living a fulfilling life in the current role that he was in. And so yeah, he eventually quits the Apple store and kind of bets his hedges on music full time, and kind of goes back to trying to attempt to, I guess, pull out a music dream in Birmingham with some of the other people he was friends with at the time.
Crept and Conan are great stories. Now, people like me and Victoria, I think we just about come across Dave and Stormzy, but not so much some of the other people in the book, the people who actually inspired them. Because there's another one with like a weird coincidence that you sort of pull into that you talk about in the book, which is that Stormzy was watching Crept and Conan while employed. Was it on the oil rigs, or he's in Portsmouth?
Yeah, it was in Southampton working on the oil.
Sorry, yeah. And then he's like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to follow my dreams. And so they inspired him. And then he later said that they're the ones who opened all the doors. Can you tell us a bit about them? Because they're such important characters in this.
Yeah, so Krept and Conan are a group from South London, Croydon, and South London was one of the 3 regions I focused on in the book. Not just because I'm from South London, but I think it had like a really interesting story because I'd seen how I grew up listening to Krept and Conan, and I'd seen how powerful their music had been, like really introspective, both really open and vulnerable, and use music as almost as a tool of like reformation for themselves. But they were the first artists, rappers from Croydon anyway, who kind of broke open a door for the likes of Stormzy to run through afterwards. And in my time reporting in South London, I'd hear all of these different stories from people about the impact that they, Krept and Conan, had had on the region. And one of them was like this little coincidence about Stormzy watching. Stormzy went to the same school as them. He was a few years below them. And so he knew them and they knew each other in the same area. But of course, when you reach 18, people's lives go in different directions. And Stormzy's life took him to an oil refinery in Southampton where he was working. And then he was watching the MOBO Awards one evening, and Krept and Conan were on stage. His childhood friends who he'd grown up with and seen since they were 12, 11, 13 were now winning like huge awards on TV and becoming successful musicians. And yes, Stormzy says that that was the moment for him where he thought, what am I doing? Like I'd love to be a musician too. I know that I have this in me and it's the thing that I actually really want to do with my life. And so when he saw that, he kind of quit his job, moved back to London and decided to, I guess, give music the full swing.
Amazing. Now, what about I'm just looking at some of the people that you talk about. Yeah, the other thing I want to talk about is you just mentioned the lyrics, and basically this sort of, you know, these are literary creations. Rap, isn't it? It's poetry. It's incredibly inventive, and often very sort of witty. There's a lot of humor in it. I guess a small one I liked was I wrote this down somewhere. Yeah, this kind of self-awareness, you know, because what's sort of so unfair about I mean, I remember that a few years ago there was this kind of fuss about drill, and even some of the songs were banned, and you're thinking these young people with nothing really have got together in a gang. They've written songs, recorded them, made a video. I mean, the amount of ingenuity and work that's gone into that is unbelievable. And then they just get kind of banned and attacked by the kind of mainstream culture or whatever. And you have a rapper called Giggs. You quote, you quote some of his lines, and you know, he's been sort of doing some drug dealing and stuff, and then says, "Forgive me, God, I'm sinning for my wages."
Yeah.
Great line. It's, you know, so, and there is that. A lot, you know, a lot of them are quite religious, either Christian or convert to Muslim too. So there's that sort of other influence we haven't talked about yet, which is the sort of the churches their parents were a part of, singing. I know Stormzy is very sort of Christian. How does that sort of feed into it as well?
Yeah, faith is such at the heart of a lot of these stories, and it's something I only realized in retrospect, really, because spending, as I say, with talking to a lot of these people, I spent a long time gathering the stories, and it was about 5 years in total of sitting with people and hearing their life stories. And one thing that came through a lot of the time was that people felt that they needed faith, quite heavy faith, to, I guess, try and see a future for themselves, or try to imagine a future for themselves that they didn't necessarily think they could get to by themselves. And that's where I think faith and religion came in that it was almost like a crutch and a vessel for people to be able to cross from one life where maybe they're doing things that they don't actually want to do, but quite destructive things, and of course like end up in things like prison and in some cases death, to cross over from that life into something more legitimate, and to something more wholesome and to something more fulfilling. And religion played a really big role in that for a lot of them. There, speak to Phil, who we touched on lightly, who from Cardiff, he converts to Christianity. Cadet in South London converts to Islam. Krept and Conan convert to Islam. So there's faith plays a big hold in it. And I think also it's also just a reflection of what life is like in these places in South London, in West Midlands, in pockets of South Wales. Is that I was just looking to essentially capture everyday life and how music moves through our everyday lives. And when trying to do that, I think faith and religion is inevitably going to be there too.
Now tell us about the Asteroid Boys. That's a good story. That they were like a Welsh kind of outfit, weren't they?
Yeah, they were a Welsh group from Cardiff, and Phil, Benji, and
Phil
Del.
was one, yeah.
Yeah, Phil was like the founding member, and their story is really powerful. I met them in 2018 or so, so just after their band had split up, but they were the first, I guess, group to essentially put Welsh rap on the map in that way. But to also deeper than that, I think they added like a new idea into what Welsh identity was, because I think for a lot of people outside of Wales, when I speak to people, like their idea of Wales was like essentially like a lot of what North Wales is like beautiful, picturesque farmlands, villages. And Wales is that, but then there's also the other side of Wales in like South and East Cardiff, which is, I guess, kind of areas that had been forgotten after the industrialization had taken place, and the city had tried to move on with new industry. You have these pockets of working class communities all along like that Cardiff to Newport seaboard, where there were young people growing up, I guess, in I guess challenging socially, economic challenging environments too, and Asteroid Boys were a real representation of that. But I look to kind of tell the personal stories of the three people involved in those bands. So not just about what was it like growing up in Cardiff at the time and where had your families come from, Greece, Cyprus, Jamaica, England, Wales, but then also what music, what was it like being in a band, and what was it like almost being in like the eye of the fire at that time? And how does like a young 21-year-old, 22-year-old deal with that? And in often cases, not well, unfortunately, I guess, how the music.
Well, one of them got sent to prison for 18 months. That kind of disturbed the flow slightly.
Yeah. So it's so interesting in that you find that just because they got signed by Sony, just because a record label comes and gives you like a really nice record contract that doesn't strip away all of the previous traumas that had been eating at you before that. So Benji gets sent to prison, and he'd already been struggling with alcohol issues and some drug issues and substance issues, and those continued throughout, even though just because he got signed, they didn't disappear. And a lot of his story is about trying to wrestle with that and navigate that. And that ultimately is one of the reasons the band ends up breaking up, and they have to kind of try to find a new sense of meaning after, I guess, their boyhood dream of becoming successful musicians had not only been achieved, but then also been shattered too.
What are they doing now, Asteroid Boys?
Yeah, so some of them are still making music. When I was met with Benji, he was driving vans across the South Wales valleys and doing deliveries in the mornings. One of the guys, Del, he was a producer, but he was then making like on YouTube there are like tape packs, they call them, like production packs, and he was making production packs. And then Phil went through a lot of jobs. He kind of got really depressed after Asteroid Boys ended. He got really ill for a little bit. And then he started working in like a factory and slowly started to build his life together from that, but ended up getting married and hasn't started a family yet, but bought a house with his wife, and almost started a new chapter of his life, which I think was important to show that just as much as you have people like Stormzy, who are of course huge musicians and selling out festivals and on the cover of big magazines and whatnot, that the legacy of the music extends deeper into like the more everyday lives of people who maybe have a quite a legacy of what the music meant to them.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a good point, because I mean, you know, there's only one Stormzy, but there's like hundreds of other people who are who are creating and who created amazing lives for themselves. Okay, they're not going to sort of like make a living out of it. I mean, do you think people is there like a sort of halfway house? Some of the people like sort of they continue with some sort of musical career, but they haven't got all the pressure on that to make all the money. So they have some other sort of a job, a part-time job or something, or some, you know, means of generating some income, which will also give them the time. I mean, I think it was philosophically very idlerish. One of the it was Desperate when he was working in Apple. And I think this guy comes in and gives him this little bit of philosophical reflection.
Yeah.
He says, why are you doing this when you should be, you know, the point of work is to provide the leisure in which you do the thing that you want to do. And, you know, if you devote too much time to the thing that you don't want to do, work, which you're only doing for the money, it can leave not enough time for the thing that you sort of should be doing.
Yeah, that was such a bit, and kind of harks back to the talk we just had on time, but that was a really big element of it was, this guy walks into the Apple store and essentially starts giving him like tongue-in-cheek lecture about you need to think seriously about how you're spending your time and what's bringing you fulfillment. And I think that really struck at a core of a lot of the stories in the book, because you see a lot of the people in there and a lot of the stories. It's about people just trying to figure out, I guess, the things that we're all trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to live a meaningful life or a successful life? How do you find purpose within that? And of course, a lot of them, music is going to be the thing that's going to give them purpose. But I guess the issue is that it's not that easily attainable. So that's when you run into risk and jeopardy. And how do you then resolve these things? Especially like something like Desperate, and a lot of them had young families or young children. So it's about also that trying to, I guess, find a place for yourself in the world whilst there are all these external factors hovering over you.
Neef, what about Corrupt FM? Is that like a sort of is that a satire that you find funny? People do nothing.
I've actually never watched it. Yeah, but I've heard good things. I've heard funny things anyway, and I've seen some things. They seem quite funny. But yeah.
Because I mean, although it's it's a comedy, but they also are dealing with some sorts of similar issues, because they have like babies and they've got to sort of get some sort of cash flowing into the household somehow or other.
Yeah.
One day they might have to give up this idea of being a sort of full-time grime DJ. Now, what about the technology stuff? A lot of the people that you talk about, obviously they're using whatever. I mean, black music in general seems to me it's always like way ahead. It's always pushing forward, using innovating. It doesn't go backwards. It looks forwards all the time. I mean, it brings in the old influences. And there's always been this traditionally an embrace of new technology. How do people? I mean, what's the sort of general view on things like YouTube and Patreon and all these things? I mean, are people actually, are they positive, or are we just sort of working for free for things like YouTube and social media? What's the feeling out there with the sorts of people who are, making music, the people you're talking about?
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, actually. I think, definitely I think YouTube has kind of changed the way in which, I guess, like music is consumed, and then so the streaming services. But I think for rap anyway, they were really useful platforms, because I guess they kind of took the barriers down in terms of what it meant to entry points for being a musician. So now if you're a 15-year-old or 16-year-old, there's no barrier for entry for you to essentially start finding a place to upload your music and to release your music. You've got YouTube, you've got the streaming services. Now you've obviously got social media, you've got TikTok and Instagram and whatnot. So I think that's really been useful. But I think it's illustrative of something that's been happening in these scenes for like a long time now, which I guess is like that very DIY element. When we go back to the Windrush generation, one of the first stories I tell in the book is of a guy, Cecil Morris, who started pirate radio station all across Birmingham, essentially. Just, I think it was after the war, when tower blocks start scaling up all around Birmingham, and he starts using them to I guess put pirate radio stations in them, in spare flats in people's kitchens. He'd set up pirate radio stations and play reggae out to the community, when at a time when I guess like there was no other outlet for it. Like the BBC wouldn't play it, BRMB radio wouldn't play it. So he took it in his hands to play it himself, and really turned his own environment into a vessel for the music. And I think that's like an illustration of almost like of what we see today still, that process.
And but it was, although for him it was much more risky, because he was getting, I think you said he got like threatened with arrest 190 times. There was some ridiculous figure. I mean, they were constantly trying to sort of close him down.
Yeah.
There were, I sort of dimly recall listening to pirate radio stations in my sort of late teens and early 20s, and they were quite often sort of quite amateurish, I suppose. Like, Mum, could you pick up some frozen peas from Iceland on your way home, but there's amazing music, but and they'll be raided. I mean, it was they were taking sort of big risks, those people with the pirate radio stations. I don't know if they're still going, but it was it was a sort of risky endeavor.
Yeah, no, definitely. He literally risked his livelihood and freedom. As you say, the station got torn down over, I think, 300 times. I think he used about 400 or 500 different flats across Birmingham to set up the station, and was, I guess, in eternal tug of war with like the DTI, who were like the arm of the council who's tasked to pull down pirate radio stations. He would just be setting up in the morning, they'd come and pull it down in the afternoon, he'd set up somewhere else. But also like the emotional toll it took on him was like a big thing that came through in the book. And I think even when the eventually gets arrested and his trial goes to, is it the Crown Court in London? One of the first of its kind. But I think even the judge says that he was doing an incredible thing for the community, and he was helping so many young people who wanted to be involved in radio. He'd bring them into the radio station and teach them how to be DJs. They broadcast community shows, broadcast when funerals were taking place, really letting people know in the community what was going on. And the judge acknowledged all of these things. Of course, it's still pirate radio though, so it was illegal. So
he can't. It's actually illegal. So there's not much the judge could do in that situation. Yeah. At least he made that judgment there and like said something positive. Which you can, and the research in the book is massive. I mean, how many? And you said, we were talking before, but you said that out of like 50 or 60 interviews, only one was on Zoom, and even in the pandemic. So you really make a big effort to just go out and see your interview subjects, in their homes, places of work, or whatever.
Yeah, that was really important to me. My favorite literature is narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction, however people want to describe it or term it. And in those books, the emphasis is always on reporting. So some of the books I read in the lead up to writing this book were all where people spent a lot of time reporting. There's a book called Thank You for Your Service by a guy called David Finkel, and he was reporting on soldiers in Iraq. He followed a platoon all through their service in Iraq, and then he followed them for like 3 years after they came back from Iraq, and talked about what toll does war have on these individuals and their lives. And he really quite painfully tells a lot of their life stories. Those are the kind of books that had always inspired me and influenced me. And I was keen to try and bring that study of human life to Britain in that way, and to also to like these communities which don't often get that. So yeah, all of my bar one interview, all of them were done in person, kind of just spending 6, 7, 8 hours with somebody over the course of a day and just chatting at length about the interior details of their lives. And then I'd say, well, yeah, I'll see you later, I'll come back next week. And I did that for 5 years. So yeah, got to really gather a lot of detail in a lot of these people's lives, a lot of it which couldn't even just make the book because there was so much information.
Yeah, you must have had to throw out so much material as well. I mean, that must have been difficult knowing what to keep in and keep out.
Yeah, that was the tough part. And I think that's where things like you start to rely on like craft and structure and narrative structure. And thankfully I had like a lot of good writers I could speak to who would give me advice about how to structure, I guess, this kind of almost creative nonfiction in that way. But yeah, that was difficult. I think I probably have like, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of transcripts that might not see the light of day. So yeah.
Well, you can put them in the Ekpoudom archives. They'll be looked into by your equivalent in like 100 years. Don't throw them away. Make sure they're printed out. Then they're not lost on a hard drive or something. Now, because before we go to questions, can we talk about the story of So Solid Crew again? I kind of we were saying earlier, audience members, it's been great for me and Victoria to start to understand the music that our kids, were listening to. I did follow music until, I suppose when they were born. About 20 years ago. It's gone past very quickly. And I sort of vaguely remember So Solid Crew. I mean, they were doing really well at one point. And there's a very attractive idea about, and there was the Soul to Soul thing around the same time, or a bit earlier, of a sort of black-owned business, a collective. They're doing their own thing. It's an independent label. They're not part of a, Sony or something like that. But they're really hard to sustain. And what happened with So Solid? They went up and then it kind of collapsed.
Yeah, so they were a group from like Clapham and Battersea, which again is one of the other places the book focuses on, and one of the chapters tells the story of their rise and then eventual fall. They were, at the time, they were like among the most popular musicians in the country. Like I remember growing up as a boy, and I remember I was living in Lewisham at the time, and you could just stand on outside of your house and you just see car after car would just be playing So Solid Crew's music. And that always really struck me because this was before the music had even got like any official releases, before albums. It was just on pirate radio or on vinyls or on tapes. And I was like, it was interesting to see like how music lives in a community and lives in a place, and the space, I guess, it kind of occupies. And so I always knew I wanted to write about them at some point, because I felt like having seen the impact firsthand, I wanted to kind of archive that and put that into history and put that moment into history. And I think they were a really big group. There were like 30 plus members of them, which I think helped them with their rise, because they were able to gather a lot of momentum. They do these really smart things where they play like 2 or 3 shows on the same night, and 7 would go and play in this club, 7 would go and play in this club, 7 would go and play in another club, and built up like a real head of steam. And I guess people from kind of became like a representation of South London in a way. People loved them. They were making like garage, but blended with rap in a lot of ways. But as they started to rise, I think it was time in the early 2000s, there were a few issues they encountered. One of which was that in a lot of places, there was like a lot of gun crime going on across the UK, across London, Birmingham, and Nottingham, and a few other places too. And because the nature of So Solid's music, I guess, they would say it was a reflection of the experiences they'd lived through and what they'd seen. I guess politicians started to tie the rise in gun crime to So Solid Crew. But I think obviously if you look into what was going on in the early 2000s, you quickly see there was like a huge social and economic factors in a lot of working class places that was more so leading to it. But they obviously got the blame, and that kind of
it's a similar sort of NWA sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, essentially that. Yeah, they had like their real peak at the Brit Awards. They won the Brit Awards for, I think it was best song and best video, and then after that they start to get tagged with gun crime issues and gun crime labels. And then of course with a group of 30 plus people, and all of them are in their young 20s, frictions start to emerge in the group. Some people leave, people want to go off and do their own thing, and some people do fall into legal issues. And they reach also a point which is, I guess, and something that's not quite spoken about with a lot of UK rappers, is that when you come out of some of these places and you're a notorious person in your neighborhood, you become a target as well. So that happened for a lot of them. A lot of them became targets.
The target meaning that people are going to sort of try and rob them.
Yeah, rob them, harm them, or some might be jealousy, these kind of things.
Okay, yeah.
Or there are already neighborhood disputes, and if you're a prominent musician from one area, people from another area aren't necessarily going to like that. So some of them ran into those issues as well.
They're sort of I don't know, they're creating resentment because they've been successful, so other people are sort of resenting their success.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think I spoke to one musician recently, and they were saying it's kind of, you're 20 and then all of a sudden you're around your peers, and all of a sudden you may get signed for 6 figures, and nobody around you has an experience of that before. And so some people look at that as like, why are you the person out of all of us that has suddenly within a night gone to being like essentially a wealthy person when I'm still struggling? And so that was a lot of issues that was an issue for them too.
Yeah, I could imagine that. That's really, and then and how do they deal with that? Do they sort of I mean, I know sometimes, you know, bands that are successful, they sort of employ their friends sometimes and try and spread the money out. But then there'll be someone else who says, why did you give him a job or her a job? Why did you give her money, you know, and not me, or, you know, some other relation or something? So those pressures can be serious, you know. So I'm sure they're not kind of, you know, they don't want to be seen to be complaining about the success, but there are the downsides.
Yeah, no, definitely. There, as you say, like the pressures are so unique for people who find themselves in those situations, and then often there's no blueprint for that. And there's nobody. When I was speaking to a lot of the musicians, some of them, their grandparent, like there's nobody in their family who's touched that level of money before. So you talk to them and say they kind of felt lost in a lot of ways, because you suddenly reach a point where you're totally alienated from your community and your family, and if you want advice, there's nobody to really turn to with how to deal with those things. And then that's where like some people really struggle with that. There's a guy in the book, Dale, from Astro Boys. His version is to just he just doesn't talk about his life at all to the rest of his friends or family when he was living in Newport. he'd be playing Glastonbury one day. He was really young. He was the youngest person in the book at the time who was experiencing that. So it was like doing his GCSEs, was like 15, 16.
Oh.
Saturday, he'd play Glastonbury.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he'd go back to Newport and he'd say where he was from in Newport. Some people had never left Newport before, let alone like left Wales. And so they'd be like, what have you been up to? And he just would say nothing because partly he felt guilty, but also he felt that he didn't want to be judged by, I guess, his peers and didn't want to kind of stick his head above the parapet in that sense too. So yeah, you see all of these really unique pressures and mental pressures that face a lot of these musicians.